Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. At dawn, Noah tightened a squeaky gate hinge until a white SUV with Whispering Oaks HOA decals rolled up his drive uninvited. By sundown, his barn was in flames. What started as a polite inspection spiraled into arson, surveillance, and a land war no clipboard could contain. The morning had started like most others, slow, quiet, and smelling faintly of old hay and percolating coffee. I was out by the east gate tightening the hinges that had been giving me trouble ever since a buck tried to take it head-on in the fall. The sun was just beginning to cast that pale gold over the fields, and the only sound was the metallic creak of my wrench and a few distant crows announcing whatever doom crows normally like to announce. Then I heard it. The soft crunch of tires on the gravel that didn't belong to anything I owned. I stood up and wiped my hands on the back of my jeans just in time to watch a white SUV with a ridiculous wraparound decal that read, Whispering Oaks Homeowners Association, pull up to my drive like they had an invitation. 3 people got out, 2 men and a woman. The men were dressed in matching windbreakers like they were on their way to inspect a dam or harass a food truck. The woman led the way, and even before she opened her mouth, I knew. The haircut said it all. This was a Karen with a capital K and a personalized clipboard. "Good morning," she said, offering me a tight-lipped smile like I'd already disappointed her. "I'm Karen Craig, president of the Whispering Oaks Homeowners Association. We're conducting a safety perimeter inspection this week and need to do a walkthrough of your property." I blinked. "You're what now?" She gestured vaguely behind her, where the 2 windbreakers were already surveying my fence like they were sizing up a condemned building. "Routine safety protocol. We've had concerns raised about the fire risks associated with unregulated outbuildings, especially this close to residential zones. You're technically within our expanded buffer." I crossed my arms. That's funny because I don't recall joining any homeowners association. This land's been in my name for over 10 years, and it's 60 acres of registered private agricultural use. "Your buffer doesn't mean a damn thing out here." Karen's smile didn't waver, but it thinned. "Well, our updated neighborhood charter includes all parcels within 1 mile of Whispering Oaks proper. It's an evolving standard. We have a duty to maintain safety for our residents, and that includes properties like yours that directly impact our environmental perimeter." That's a lot of words to say. "We want control where we have none," I said, stepping between her and my fence line. "Let me say it real clear. You and your clipboard commandos are trespassing. Turn around, get back in your HOA mobile, and drive it back to wherever your bylaws stop mattering." One of the men, tall, sunglasses, probably the kind of guy who uses Bluetooth earbuds in the grocery store, spoke up. "We're not trying to cause trouble, sir. Just documenting potential hazards." He was aiming a phone at my tool shed. "You take one more photo of my shed, and I'll consider that evidence of stalking," I said. "You want to see hazards? I've got a rake with a loose handle and an axe that's seen better days." Karen stepped forward. "This is highly uncooperative, Mr. Brenner. I would hate to escalate this, but we are legally permitted to document issues of concern. Unless you have a warrant or an invite, you're not permitted to set foot on my dirt," I replied. "So unless you plan on going through me, you're leaving. Now." She stared at me for a long moment. I could see her brain calculating. Behind her, one of the windbreakers mumbled something about calling the county. She didn't move. Then she said it. "Some people don't realize how dangerous it is to stand alone, but that's all right. We're good at reminders." With that, she turned and walked back to the SUV. The men followed, pausing only to give my property one last look like it had personally offended them. The SUV turned around without another word and rolled off in a cloud of dust. I stood there for a while after they were gone, the wrench still hanging from my hand. My dog Cooper came trotting around the corner of the barn with a stick in his mouth, completely unaware of the bureaucratic nonsense that had just invaded our morning. I scratched behind his ears and looked out at the pasture. Something told me that wasn't the last I'd see of Karen Craig. I woke up to the sound of sirens. Not the kind that gradually wail in the distance while you sip your morning coffee and wonder who crashed on the interstate. No, these were close, frantic, and getting louder by the second. I jumped out of bed, pulled on my boots without socks, and threw open the front door to a wall of smoke rolling across the yard like a damn freight train. The sky above my barn, or what used to be my barn, was orange, not the soft golden kind you get at sunrise. This was rage orange, hellfire orange, Flames licked the sky, devouring the roof with greedy speed, and I could already hear the dry timbers popping like distant gunshots. My heart hammered in my chest as I sprinted across the yard. By the time I got to the edge of the fence, the volunteer fire crew had already arrived, 2 trucks, lights spinning like carnival rides, and half a dozen guys in turnout gear barking commands. One of them, a broad-shouldered redhead named Ricky, waved me back. "Stay behind the tape, Noah. We've got it contained to the barn. No spread to the fields yet." Yet, I watched in numb silence as the place went up. That barn had stood for over 70 years. It housed my tools, my old tractor, a winter's worth of dried feed, irrigation supplies, and a shelf full of parts labeled in Sharpie that only I could decipher. And now, in less than 15 minutes, it was becoming ash. When the flames finally gave up their last breath and the last jet of water hissed over charred beams, Ricky walked over, helmet in one hand, soot on his face. "Sorry, man. Fast burn. Dry season, full of old hay. It doesn't take much." "I know," I muttered. "I used to work fire investigations. This wasn't spontaneous combustion, Ricky." He gave me a look. "You think it was deliberate. I think the fire started unnaturally fast for a barn with no power lines and no appliances plugged in. And I think you'd find residual accelerants if you brought in a dog." He rubbed the back of his neck. "County budget's tight. No dog unless the initial sweep shows something. I'll put it in the report, but you know how it is." Yeah, I knew exactly how it was. A place burns in the middle of nowhere. They chalk it up to hay and sunshine. It doesn't matter that I'm careful, that I check every shed before bed, that I haven't had a single electrical rig inside that barn since I retired and bought this place. It's just an old building full of dry things. Perfect for a lazy explanation. Later, when the smoke had thinned and the firemen packed up, I walked the edge of the wreckage alone. The ashes were still warm, but not enough to stop me from kneeling near what had once been the northeast corner. That's where I'd kept the diesel drums, sealed, elevated, and far from any ignition source. That corner burned first. You could tell by the way the char spread outward, like ripples from a stone. I spotted a sliver of something shiny in the ash and used a stick to fish it out. A half-melted cap from a plastic gasoline canister, blackened but unmistakable. A few feet away, tire tracks veered off the gravel road and looped into the field before doubling back. Not mine. I hadn't driven there in weeks, and someone else had. I didn't call the sheriff. Not yet. Not without more. No witness, no clean prints, and they'd call it coincidence anyway. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened the folder where I'd saved yesterday's photos. The white HOA SUV, Karen's smug face framed in a polite grimace, and her 2 clipboard soldiers photographing my barn. Coincidence? Sure. And maybe the Tooth Fairy lit the match. I didn't sleep that night. I tried. I even poured myself a double shot of the good stuff and sat out on the porch, watching the wind play in the grass, hoping the silence would settle my mind. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw flames curling out of the barn walls, swallowing everything I'd built, everything I'd repaired, labeled, trusted. You don't spend 10 years creating order out of dirt and rust just to watch it go black overnight. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. I called Ben. Ben Connolly had been the best forensic chemist in 3 counties before he left the state lab and started freelancing. Burned out by bureaucracy, he said. Ironic, considering what he did now was mostly cleaning up behind the very same system that failed him. But I trusted him. We'd worked a dozen arson cases together back in the day. If there was even a trace of accelerant left in those ashes, he'd find it. By noon, he was pulling up my drive in a battered Subaru with more antennae than a radio tower. He stepped out wearing jeans, a canvas vest, and an expression that said he hadn't been surprised by much since 2013. "You weren't kidding," he said, scanning the wreckage. "That's not a burn. That's a message." I nodded. I was hoping you'd say otherwise. He suited up, walked the perimeter, took samples. Bits of scorched wood, char from the epicenter, even the melted cap I'd found. We worked silently, like we always did. No need for words when you both knew what you were looking for. As he packed the samples, I told him everything. The HOA visit, Karen's little speech about reminders, the clipboard guys taking pictures of the barn, the expanded buffer zone fantasy, the absurd idea that my farm somehow endangered their McMansion cul-de-sac with its overly independent existence. Ben raised an eyebrow. "And you didn't call the sheriff?" "Not yet. I want more than soot and paranoia." "Fair enough," he said, "but don't wait too long. People like that, if they're willing to torch a barn, they're not done." While Ben drove off to his lab, I got to work on my own insurance policy. I drove into town, bought 6 outdoor security cameras, a handful of floodlights, and a motion sensor kit built for ranches twice the size of mine. I spent the rest of the day drilling brackets into fence posts and syncing cameras to a local server I set up in my office. Every inch of my property's edge, especially the road-facing parts, would now be under 24/7 surveillance. I also changed every lock, twice. The next morning, while tightening a mount near the western pasture, I spotted a red envelope in my mailbox. No postage, hand-delivered. Inside was a glossy trifold pamphlet titled "Community Responsibility, The Danger Next Door." I read the first line and almost laughed. Did you know one poorly maintained property can reduce home values by up to 8%? The second line named me directly. Mr. Noah Brenner's recent activities have raised concerns regarding safety, environmental impact, and visual cohesion with the greater Whispering Oaks region. Visual cohesion. My God. There was no signature, but the formatting matched the HOA's earlier printouts exactly. Same smug font, same language, and in the corner, the HOA logo. A little oak leaf trying to look noble. I stood there by the fence, the wind tugging at the edges of that stupid pamphlet, and realized something crucial. They weren't just trying to scare me. They were laying groundwork. This wasn't vandalism. This was a campaign. One step at a time. Discredit, isolate, then act. And the fire? That wasn't the end. That was the opening salvo. An hour later, Ben called. "Traces of gasoline, Noah. Not barn fuel. Off the shelf, standard grade, with elevated benzene levels. Probably poured fast and from a plastic canister." "You were right. Definitely arson." My throat tightened. "Can you write it up? Full analysis?" "It's already printing. And you better brace yourself. If they did this, they're not afraid of legal lines." "I'm not either," I said. And I meant it. A few days passed without a peep. No SUVs, no envelopes, no late-night activity on the cameras. Just silence. But it wasn't the kind that lets you relax. It was the heavy kind, the kind that presses down behind your ribs and makes you check over your shoulder every time you step outside. I didn't stop working. I reviewed every frame the cameras had recorded, even the boring ones. Raccoons sniffing fence posts, a fox slinking along the tree line, a pair of teenagers cutting across the southern edge on bikes, probably trying to get to the river trail. But no HOA, no Karen, not a single windbreaker in sight. That was until Friday morning. I was halfway through repairing the busted sprinkler line when I heard a knock. Not at the front door, no. This one echoed off the metal gate at the driveway entrance. I walked over, wiping dirt from my hands, and saw 2 figures standing outside the gate. One in a police uniform, the other with a familiar sheet of blonde hair and a legal pad clutched like a holy relic. Karen Craig. I tapped the code on the keypad and stepped through the smaller gate on foot, keeping it mostly shut behind me. "Karen," I said. Brought backup this time. The officer was someone I recognized, though barely. Bill Drake, one of those guys who made sergeant without ever making an impression. Stiff posture, perfectly ironed uniform, and a face that always looked like it had just smelled something faintly offensive. He spoke first. "Mr. Brenner, we're here in response to several formal complaints filed through Whispering Oaks HOA regarding possible code violations on your property. Ms. Craig is requesting a safety inspection." I stared at him for a full second. "Is that right?" Karen spoke up, sugary as antifreeze. "We're concerned about potential hazards, structural instability, proximity to flammable materials, unregulated pesticide storage. You understand, community risk. It's our duty to keep everyone safe." "Karen," I said, "I am not, have never been, and will never be a member of your HOA. You have zero jurisdiction here. Your concern is noted. Your inspection is denied." Bill cleared his throat. "Mr. Brenner, while you're correct that your property is not under the HOA, we're obligated to investigate complaints of public endangerment if formally submitted to the sheriff's department. I'm not here to enforce HOA policy, just to ensure you're in compliance with county code." That's when I noticed something. Karen wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the trees behind the fence, eyes darting left and right. Nervous. Or maybe scouting. "Fine," I said. "Then let me see the formal complaint." The actual documents filed, names, dates, signatures, not HOA newsletters, and not Karen's signature in pink ink. Bill hesitated, then sighed. We don't have a hard copy on us. The call came through this morning. I can request a copy for you. Request away, I said, but no one steps foot past this gate without a warrant. You know the law, Bill. Karen opened her mouth, probably to launch into one of her signature speeches about civic duty, but my motion alert buzzed in my pocket. I pulled out my phone and tapped into the live feed from the eastern fence line. One of the windbreaker twins from the previous visit, the taller one, I was sure, was standing just beyond the barbed edge of my back field, near the chicken coop perimeter. He didn't see the camera tucked in the old post above him. Not until he did something stupid. He reached into his jacket, pulled something small and black from his pocket, and tossed it casually over the fence. It landed in the grass. I raised my eyes slowly from the phone. You might want to stick around for this, I said to Bill, my voice even. Without waiting, I strode around the side of the property, unlocked the maintenance gate, and made a beeline to the spot. It didn't take long to find a smooth black plastic device about the size of a pack of gum with a blinking red light and a serial number. On the back, the tiny printed logo of a private security contractor, ArrowPoint Solutions. I carried it back like a dirty diaper, dangling it by the edge. Karen's face paled as soon as she saw it. Care to explain? I asked, holding it up like a bloody glove. Because unless this is HOA branded birdseed, your boy just committed a felony. Bill's jaw tightened. Is this recording? Yep, I said. Time-stamped, geotagged, uploaded. You're in the frame too. Karen was already retreating. That's not ours, she snapped. I don't know what that is. Anyone could have... Save it, I said, slipping the tracker into a Ziploc bag and sealing it. This is private property. And your little surveillance stunt. That's criminal trespass, Karen. I hope your lawyer charges by the hour. She turned to Bill. Sergeant, do something. He hesitated just long enough to make it clear he wasn't thrilled to be involved. I'll file the report, he muttered. But this is beyond the scope of the original complaint. Good, I said. And while you're at it, maybe include the fact that one of her associates just tried to bug my land like it was a meth house. Karen's expression collapsed into a tight mask of fury, but she didn't argue. She stormed off toward the gate, pulling out her phone, probably texting one of her legal leeches to start spinning a counter-narrative. Bill followed, slower this time, not meeting my eyes as they drove away. I watched them disappear down the road, then turned back to the bag in my hand. I had physical evidence now. Not just theory, not just suspicion, but a tracker thrown over a fence by someone connected to the very people who'd already tried to paint me as a hazard. I didn't know what their next move would be, but I knew what mine was. Tomorrow, I'd be sitting in a law office. The next morning, I shaved, put on a clean flannel that didn't smell like smoke or dirt, and drove into town with the tracker sealed in its evidence bag, sitting on the passenger seat like a dead fish I didn't want to smell twice. The law office of Jane Ellis was tucked behind the old grain elevator off Main Street. Quiet place, brick building, no-nonsense secretary with half glasses and a gaze that could freeze spilled coffee mid-air. Jane had been my go-to for contracts when I first bought the farm. Back then, she helped me make sure the land was fully insulated from municipal absorption and any HOA creep. She was smart, thorough, and had the kind of smile that said, "Try me. I dare you." She listened without interrupting as I walked her through everything. The uninvited inspection, the pamphlets, the fire, the tracker, and the surveillance footage. She watched the clip twice. When it ended, she sat back, folded her hands over her desk, and said, "They just made a very expensive mistake. You think it's enough?" "Not yet," she said. "But it's enough to start turning up the heat." Within an hour, she had me signing paperwork. We filed a formal cease and desist against the Whispering Oaks HOA and its executive officers, citing trespassing, harassment, and attempted surveillance on private property. Then she helped me draft a civil complaint, naming Karen Craig personally, along with the HOA, for orchestrated intimidation, defamation, and interference with quiet enjoyment of property. The fire? That was the wild card. She wanted more. "Right now," Jane said, tapping the desk, "we're accusing them of a pressure campaign and criminal trespass. But the arson? That's a felony. We need something that links it directly to them. Witnesses, receipts, internal communication. Otherwise, they'll claim coincidence and play dumb." I told her about Ben and his analysis. She perked up. "Perfect. We'll add it as a supplemental affidavit." It's not enough for a conviction, but it paints a pattern, especially paired with the tracker. When I got home that evening, I half expected to find another fire or a billboard calling me enemy of the community, but the cameras showed nothing out of the ordinary. Just dusk settling in, the occasional rustle in the brush, and a fox trotting along the fence like he owned the place. I poured a drink and sat in the kitchen, staring at the table, when my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. A man's voice, smooth, corporate. "Mr. Brenner." "Speaking." "This is Glenn Mallory. I'm the Community Outreach Director for Whispering Oaks. I understand there's been tension. I'd like to propose a meeting, neutral ground, friendly discussion. No lawyers." I laughed once. "Let me guess, you'll bring a fruit basket, I'll give you 10 acres and access to my soul?" He chuckled. "Just coffee. We don't want this to escalate any further. We think this has all been a misunderstanding. Your misunderstanding tried to burn my barn down and bugged my property." A pause. "We're prepared to make a generous offer, Mr. Brenner. Whispering Oaks is exploring controlled expansion. We believe your property could be rezoned, sold to responsible developers. You'd be compensated quite well." There it was. I let the silence hang just long enough to hear his confidence start to bend. "No," I said, and hung up. That night, I heard a noise at the edge of the property. The new east gate sensor tripped. When I checked the feed, all I saw was a figure in a hoodie slipping away into the trees. No damage, no entry, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found a drone on my lawn. Plastic, cheap, but equipped with a small camera. Still running, still recording. The footage showed a low pass over my shed, around my new barn frame, and up to the house before it must have run out of battery and crash-landed near the coop. That was enough. Jane filed for an emergency protective injunction. We added the drone to our evidence pile. We also updated the complaint with Ben's lab results and a request to compel the county to review Whispering Oaks' internal communications. I figured they'd keep pushing, maybe even start threatening. But I wasn't ready for what came next. An anonymous envelope landed in my mailbox 2 days later. Inside was a printout. Not HOA branded, not official looking. A blurry screenshot from one of my security cameras. Me, standing on the back porch. Time-stamped. Across the image, someone had scrawled one sentence in thick black ink. "You don't belong here either." I stared at it for a long time. Then I scanned it, filed it with Jane, and took the afternoon off to install 2 more cameras. Let them come. 2 days later, Jane called me with the kind of voice you get only when something big breaks. The county judge had reviewed our expanded complaint, the security footage, the drone, Ben's accelerant analysis, and the now growing pile of HOA provocations, including the anonymous photo. It was enough. The court had granted a search warrant for the HOA's administrative office and Karen Craig's home. We were officially moving from theory to action. I drove into town the same morning the warrant was served, parked across from the Whispering Oaks Community Center, a sterile little building with white columns and a fake antique bell out front, like it thought it was a courthouse in 1852. 2 sheriff cruisers idled by the entrance. Deputies moved in and out, carrying boxes, hard drives, laptops. Karen wasn't there, but one of the board members was. A stocky man in a fleece vest who looked like he'd just realized the phrase civil liability wasn't just for TV dramas. Jane met me in her office 3 hours later. Her eyes lit up when she pulled out the initial findings. "You're going to like this." They found internal communications, not just meeting notes, but email threads, group chats, Slack logs, and not the polite kind. One in particular, dated a week before the fire, showed Karen messaging 2 other board members under a private thread labeled Containment Strategy. Her exact words, "If we let Brenner continue to operate unchecked, we set a precedent. He'll become a magnet for others who think they can ignore HOA structure. We need to escalate and demonstrate consequence." One of the other members replied, "How far are you willing to go?" Karen's response, "Let's say he loses something useful. That'll change his tune." I stared at the page in silence. Even printed, her words had the same smug, clipped tone I remembered from her mouth. She hadn't just been pushing boundaries, she'd been orchestrating them like a conductor with a box of matches. But it didn't end there. In her personal email archives, they found drafts of a document titled Emergency Absorption Proposal, which laid out a post-crisis procedure to annex high-risk adjacent property for the safety of the greater Whispering Oaks community. My name was mentioned 5 separate times. My land was plotted out, surveyed, assessed for resale. Jane grinned. It was never about community standards. They were planning to pressure you into a forced surrender. Your land was step 1. The prosecutor's office took immediate interest. With the internal communication and Ben's forensic report, they now had probable cause to pursue criminal charges. Karen was arrested the next morning at her home, still wearing her HOA name badge when they took her out in cuffs. The local paper ran with it. HOA president arrested in land grab scheme. Arson alleged. I bought 3 copies and lined the coop with them. The chickens seemed unimpressed, but I felt better. One of the board members, the same fleece-vested man from earlier, resigned publicly that evening. He released a statement saying he had no idea things had escalated so far, and that he'd trusted the wrong people. Another board member went dark. No calls, no emails, vanished like a rat who smelled smoke. The rest of the HOA, panic mode. Jane filed an emergency injunction to freeze their accounts and restrict their ability to vote on any new bylaws. Meanwhile, subpoenas were issued for Arrow Point Solutions, the private security firm that provided the tracker. Their internal logs showed they were contracted directly by Karen, using discretionary HOA funds under the guise of perimeter compliance monitoring. In simple terms, they were paid to spy on me, without a warrant, on land they had no jurisdiction over. The county sheriff, no longer pretending to be neutral, authorized a full audit of the HOA's financials and contract history. What they found wasn't pretty. HOA funds had been used for everything from campaign donations to Karen's husband's consulting firm, a shell company with no employees and one shared address with their summer home in the Carolinas. Whispering Oaks wasn't just overstepping, it was rotting from the head down. The final blow came when one of the Arrow Point techs admitted, under pressure, that they'd received off-record instructions to do a sweep of my barn area the week before the fire, looking for code violations and flammable hazards, they claimed. They didn't plant anything or ignite anything, but the timing was damning. That admission alone opened the floodgates. Suddenly, the prosecutor wasn't just investigating arson, they were looking at conspiracy. Jane called it a perfect storm. I called it justice working up a head of steam. By the end of that week, the court had frozen HOA operations, put Whispering Oaks under temporary receivership, and moved to formally dissolve its governing board. Karen's name became radioactive. No one defended her anymore, not in the meetings, not in the press, not even in the neighborhood Facebook group, which, believe me, had been a war zone for months. Meanwhile, I kept to the farm, fixed my fences, started rebuilding the barn with steel beams and fire-resistant siding. The security system now looked like something off a CIA field base. I even installed a weatherproof safe house for hard drives and backups. Let them try again. I had all the footage, all the files, all the receipts. And now, finally, the law on my side. The trial began on a crisp Monday morning, under the kind of sky that looked too clean for the kind of filth we were about to drag into the open. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, local homeowners, a few HOA loyalists pretending they were just there for civic interest. I walked in wearing jeans, boots, and the only blazer I owned. Jane told me I didn't have to dress up, just look like exactly who I was. A man with nothing to hide and everything to lose. Karen sat at the defense table in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my old tractor. She looked pale but composed, like someone who still believed this was all just a misunderstanding that could be fixed with the right kind of smirk. Her lawyer was sharp, expensive, and deeply uncomfortable with how much evidence we'd stacked up in the last 3 months. Jane opened with precision. She walked the jury through a timeline. The visit from HOA, the fire, the tracker, the drone, the letters, the surveillance, the arrest. She didn't yell. She didn't grandstand. She simply laid it out like a line of dominoes. One decision after another, each falling closer to criminal. The prosecution followed with the heavy guns. Ben took the stand and explained in detail how accelerant had been used, how the fire had spread unnaturally fast, and how the forensic evidence ruled out accidental combustion. They brought in the Arrow Point technician who testified that he'd been told to scout my property without notification and admitted under oath that the surveillance had been paid for by Karen using discretionary HOA funds without board approval. Then came the county auditor, who outlined how HOA funds had been rerouted into shell accounts and personal projects, none of which had any legal tie to community services. By the time I was called to testify, the jury had already seen enough to hate every syllable of the acronym HOA. I told them everything, from the first knock on my gate to the night I found a surveillance drone on my lawn. I described the way Karen spoke to me like I was a trespasser on my own soil. I talked about what it felt like to stand in the middle of a burning barn, knowing damn well it wasn't an accident. I didn't get dramatic. I didn't cry. I let the facts do the heavy lifting. But when Jane asked why I kept fighting, I looked straight at the jury and said, because if they can do it to me, someone with land, cameras, legal experience, they can do it to anyone. Karen's lawyer tried his best on cross. He painted me as an anti-establishment type, said I was hostile, uncooperative, that I'd refused to negotiate. Jane countered with evidence, letters, recordings, messages that showed the only person escalating was Karen. One of the last witnesses was a man named Allen, a former HOA board member who'd resigned mid-scandal. He testified that he'd been uncomfortable with Karen's leadership for months, said he'd seen her forge emails, manipulate votes, bully homeowners. He'd stayed quiet, he admitted, because she had power, influence, lawyers, and because he didn't think anyone could stop her. But someone did, he said, nodding toward me. The final argument was blistering. Jane described what happened as a case study in weaponized authority, an HOA president using the illusion of community concern to settle a personal grudge and seize land she had no right to. The prosecutor followed, calling it a modern-day land grab in a cardigan and pearls. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom was silent. On all counts, criminal trespass, attempted surveillance, defamation, conspiracy to commit arson, and financial misconduct, Karen was found guilty. The judge didn't mince words. He called her actions systemic abuse of a leadership role and sentenced her to 12 years in prison, no parole for at least 7. One of the Arrow Point employees received 5 years for complicity. The HOA itself was formally disbanded by court order. Then came the civil judgment. Jane had filed for damages, not just for the fire, but for emotional distress, loss of use, defamation, and legal expenses. The jury awarded me $2,400,000, more than I'd ever expected, more than I'd dared to hope for. When the gavel fell, the courtroom exhaled. I stood, turned toward Karen, and for the first time saw her expression break. Not defiance, not smug disbelief, remorse. She didn't say a word as they led her away. Outside the courthouse, people clapped. Some shook my hand. Others just nodded, like they finally understood that what had happened to me was bigger than one barn, or one woman, or one overreaching board. I didn't smile. Not yet. There was still one last thing to do. A week after the verdict, the silence on my land sounded different, not tense or watchful, but clean, like someone had finally shut off a generator that had been humming behind my skull for months. The sun rose the same way it always had, but now it felt earned. I walked the fence line with a mug of coffee in one hand and Cooper trotting at my side, his tail wagging like he could finally sense the storm was over. The old barn had been reduced to a flat, gravel-covered patch for now. Insurance came through, and I had enough from the settlement to rebuild something stronger. Metal frame, fire-resistant cladding, and motion sensors embedded into every wall like some kind of paranoid bat cave. Overkill? Maybe. But after everything that happened, I had no interest in trusting luck. The new signs I ordered arrived 2 days later. Heavy aluminum plates with reflective coating and a message in bold black type, private property. This land is not under HOA jurisdiction. Trespassers will be prosecuted. I mounted them myself on reinforced posts along the outer perimeter, one every 100 feet. Over the top? Maybe. But no one would ever say they didn't see the line. Not long after, Jane invited me to speak at a town hall event. Property rights, rural zoning, HOA overreach. Suddenly, I was a local authority on all of it. Me, a guy who just wanted to grow hay and fix tractors in peace. I almost said no. But then I thought about the others, the ones who hadn't fought back. The elderly couple down the road who got fined for leaving Christmas lights up past January. The veteran who was forced to repaint his mailbox because it was too bold. The single mother who'd been warned for parking her pickup truck too visibly in her own driveway. So I went. I stood in front of a room full of people, most of them quiet, skeptical, and I told them everything, not the dramatized version, the real story. About the clipboard diplomacy, the fake inspections, the gaslighting, the fire. About Karen Craig's slow erosion of boundaries, legal, personal, physical. When I was done, the room clapped. Not wildly, not standing ovation style. Just a solid, honest sound. The sound of people who'd heard something they recognized. I started getting calls after that. Emails, letters. Other landowners asking for advice, for help with language in their deeds, for tips on installing perimeter cameras. I didn't charge. Hell, I didn't even know how I'd bill for that. But I helped. Not long after, the county approved new zoning protections that made it harder for HOAs to encroach on rural parcels. Jane drafted most of the language. I reviewed it on my porch, coffee in hand, dog asleep at my feet. Funny how a barn fire turned into policy reform, and then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. Karen came back. I saw her through the camera before I saw her in person, standing just outside the gate, alone. No clipboard, no lawyers, no stormtroopers in windbreakers. Just her. She didn't approach the house, just waited. I considered ignoring her, but I figured if she had the guts to show up now, she deserved 5 minutes. When I reached the gate, she looked up. Her face was thinner, lines deeper, and for the first time, I didn't see calculation behind her eyes. Just fatigue. "I came to say I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know it's too late. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I lost a lot, and I realized I never understood what community really meant. I thought control was protection. I was wrong." I didn't say anything for a while, just let her speak. She didn't make excuses. She didn't ask for anything. When she turned to leave, I stopped her. "The 4th of July barbecue's next weekend," I said. "You're not invited." But I figured I'd mention it. She gave a ghost of a smile. "Fair enough." And then she walked away, leaving behind nothing but gravel dust and silence. That weekend, the barbecue was bigger than ever. Families from all over the county came. There was music, smoke from the grill, kids racing through the tall grass. Nobody talked about HOAs or courtrooms. Nobody mentioned fires. We just ate, laughed, and watched the fireworks over the pasture. As the sky lit up in reds and blues, I looked around and realized something I hadn't fully grasped before. This place, this land, wasn't just mine anymore. It was a reminder that you don't protect what's yours by locking everyone out. You protect it by standing your ground when someone tries to take it from you, and by showing others they can do the same.